Well everyone, here we are at the promised look at Sol Bianca The Legacy. Last we checked in with the crew of the Sol Bianca, they were left in an odd sort of limbo, as the funds needed to film the final installation of the trilogy had dried up, and pressing questions were left unanswered. Flash forward 8 years later though, to the year of our Lord 1999, and AIC would rectify this. In what can only be described as a bold decision, AIC decided to completely resurrect and reimagine this obscure media property with only 2 short films and a PC game to its name, and mold it into Sol Bianca The Legacy. While the piece does have some somewhat obvious flaws, before we get into any of that, I want to say just how incredible it is that this is a thing that exists at all. So many productions of the late 80s and early 90s and even later 90s withered on the vine, especially as the Japanese economy tanked in the 1990s, and the fact that one of them was reborn at all is almost unheard of. And I'm glad it was, because while Sol Bianca The Legacy is interesting enough for this alone, the episodes themselves are also at least somewhat entertaining and well produced for the most part. Look, the editing takes a while to find itself, and there are some non-logistical and motivational issues with the series' conclusions, but overall it's an enjoyable watch, and one that does feel rather atmospheric and immersive. I don't consider its flaws to be massive roadblocks from enjoying a pretty sound, at least on a technical level, production, and again, the fact that this exists at all is amazing. Like the original Sol Bianca The Legacy serves as a good sort of introduction into the kind of production that it is. In this case, an introduction into the small miniseries of the late 90s and early 2000s, which sort of became the spiritual successors to the OVAs of the decades preceding them. For this reason, this miniseries is not just a nice watch, but also a vanguard of sorts, as it ushers in the then new styles and animation techniques of the productions of the time, and the miniseries phenomenon, which was also something rooted in the very late 90s and the early 2000s. Now, the concept of Sol Bianca The Legacy is in many ways the same as the original, with a few tweaks in order to streamline it and keep it fresh. In this telling of the story, the Sol Bianca is crewed by 4 pirates of April Bykirk, Feb Fall, Janny Man, and June Ashel. Unlike in the original 2 movies, here the 5th member, that of May Jessica, is a stowaway who is slowly adopted into the crew as they resolve to get her home to her parents on Earth, which by now is a semi-mythical lost location rumored to be beautiful and vibrant. All of this is a nice restructuring of the original formula, and it makes May feel less redundant, creates a lot of room for character moments, and also sets up a lot of confrontations with the Terran forces, especially Gyunther, all of which gives this miniseries plot a spine to build off of. Getting the said plot, this is essentially the big picture. One day the pirates find a stowaway and eventually grow to care about her as they seek to get her home, only to adopt her once they learn that she has no home to return to. Going episode by episode, episode 1 is the essential set everything up pilot episode. It explains that the location of Earth is lost to time, and that the relics from its golden space frontier age are extremely rare, powerful, and valuable. It also explains that Terran forces led by Gyunther and Captain Rammy seek these relics out too, and thus are bound to chase after the Sol Bianca, which itself is a massive Earth artifact. The episode sets up April as the sort of MC, and it sets up how May gets onto the ship. Episode 2 is a sort of standalone episode where, while pursuing treasure, Jude and May are trapped in this haunted egg dungeon modeled after Dante's Divine Comedy. There's some neat metaphors here and a fight with Gyunther's guys, and no treasure. Spoiler. This episode works well, and serves the important purpose of establishing the sisterly bond between the 2 characters of June and May, one of the most important relationships of the series, and one which is the most developed throughout the series, and serves as a sort of emotional through-line from this point on. They initially dislike each other, but one dungeon later are quite close. Shout out to Sancho as well, who while only appearing in this one episode is a fun little one-episode character. Episode 3 is another standalone episode of sorts, and is the kind of Janny episode. In this episode, she teams up with Gwen in order to take down his brother, who hijacked the ship and wants to use it to attack the new president of this world out of his hatred for women. Of all the episodes, this one feels the most standalone, but it's still fun, and even allows us to see a sort of sentimental side you wouldn't expect from the gruff character of Janny. Overall, it's the one that feels the least necessary, but again, it's a fine standalone adventure, and it does afford us some neat character moments. Episode 4 is the beginning of the end, as in it, Feb and April have a falling out that ultimately results in her capture by Gyunther. The basis of this is essentially that Feb feels like she's wasting her life living as a pirate, and April basically questions what she would do otherwise, seeing as that she is an alcoholic who doesn't really do that much around here if we're being honest. While April and Percy, her new lover and excellent addition to the show, do try to rescue Feb, they ultimately fail when a hesitant Feb does not literally leap at the chance for a rescue, and everyone regroups on the Sol Bianca to plan for the future. I will say that the melodrama in this episode does feel a little sudden and forced, especially when we consider that the need to find May's parents would have guided the crew to Earth anyways, and they don't even use this as an excuse to explain how the crew found Earth. Like, they could have said, oh, we wouldn't have known Earth was here if we hadn't tracked Gyunther and Feb to it once they captured her. But they don't do this. Instead, Earth's location simply gets expositioned away in episode 5. Overall, this episode does feel a little weird, and Feb's character does seem to be done dirty, especially when we consider that while she does drink a lot in the previous episodes, it's not necessarily implied to be the crippling alcoholism that I guess it is here. But at least we get Percy? Oh, and I guess it does do a decent job of setting up the idea that there's more to Gyunther's character than we think. I don't know, episode 4 feels like a hard break from the previous story, and its inconsistent and bizarre decisions do set a sort of precedent for the next 2 episodes, which, although not as inconsistent and bizarre, do feel like they have some underlying writing issues if we really splice everything open. And that gets us to episode 5 and 6, which are the sort of 2-part finale to this little mini-series. Here, the gang manages to finally find Earth, not because they tracked Gyunther here, but literally just because some random kid in May's Zoom call classes just happens to know where it is and just tells her. Said Earth is encapsulated by Lotus, a giant sphere around the planet, which quote-unquote shields it and also houses most of its citizens. June and May go to Lotus in order to find her parents, while Janny, April, and Percy once again try to rescue Feb, extracting her from Gyunther's ship. Long story short, June and May find out that her parents are probably dead. Feb once again hesitates too long to be rescued. Gyunther explains how he became a doomer once he learned that the idea of a vibrant living Earth is just a lie. Percy dies. Fuck! And Gyunther's boss, the Admiral, goes nuts and decides to hack the Sol Bianca in order to awaken quote-unquote Mother. No, this is not explained at all, and we'll get into more of that later. Anyways, eventually everyone reunites in a battle under the Lotus and above Earth, and the Sol Bianca seems to be in dire straits. The hacking program leaves it a sitting duck, but just as the Admiral is about to seize full control of it, for whatever purpose, Gyunther, whether out of disgust for his superior, respect for April, sympathy for Feb, or just plain apathy, decides to nuke the Admiral's ship in order to stop this process. This buys the Sol Bianca just enough time to get up to strength and mop the floor with the Terran fleet. In the final scene, the crew meets up with Gyunther on the surface of the dead Earth, and he gives her April's aunt's old gun, which, to its credit, is a MacGuffin that she has sought in the background of the series the whole time. Gyunther gives April this out of respect, while implying that he once loved her aunt, and maybe that him choosing his quest for Terran artifacts over her is why he's so depressed, and why he feels like he's wasted his life. Anyways, Gyunther just kinda leaves with Captain Rammy, and the 5 pirates then affirm that May is a part of a crew now, and fly off to a new beginning. Overall, the plot to Sol Bianca The Legacy is a decent one, marred by logistical and motivational inconsistencies and questions. I will say that as the series wraps up, this becomes more prominent as the logistical and motivational quirks drive us to ask a lot of questions I don't necessarily think we should be, and it's fair to say that the wheels kind of fall off in some regards. But honestly, the conclusion doesn't drag it down too much, and I don't think the series is completely ruined by some things that don't quite make sense. The series sets out to be a nice little space adventure with some nice character moments and good animation, and it's exactly that. But it's also more, and I think that all the additions to the series should be commended, as unlike the bizarre tonal shift between the original 2 movies, everything in Sol Bianca The Legacy feels mostly consistent with the exception of how they write Feb, and even the changes or ideas that don't quite land here are still out of the box to some extent, and I appreciate that they tried. It's still a good OVA with a lot of fun moments, some good character moments, a great OST, beautiful production values, and just entertainment. It's not entirely action schlock, but there's enough of that to keep you interested when the pace slows down a little, and there are other character resolutions and lore resolutions to look forward to when you don't want just action schlock. It's definitely something that built up on the source material that it was based upon, and even if it's not an entirely coherent or successful venture at this at all times, it feels like a very earnest one, and I respect it for that, because Sol Bianca The Legacy feels like it came from a very genuine place of simply wanting to complete the incomplete that came before it, and inspired it. Now, that's not to say that there are no issues with this miniseries, though. There are some forced melodramatic moments, especially concerning Feb, and I do question a lot of the logistical side of the writing, but again, depending on what you're looking for in an OVA, you can overlook this. This is something that I was able to overlook because I was interested enough in the character bonds and general atmosphere of the series enough that it didn't really get to me. And the character bonds and atmosphere are strengths of this miniseries. While this is something that is not perfect, it is something that definitely has its strong moments, and among those are the character bonds and the production value. In the terms of character bonds, I want to say that June and May growing as sisters is something that was actually done really well. They set it up in episode 2, and by episode 6, they're basically inseparable, and I appreciate that the series took time doing this and let us know that these are real people who actually bond. April and Percy kind of also have a similar smaller arc for the 40 minutes that they share on screen. I wish Percy survived, but I guess I can live without him. I hope April can too, though, because he seemed like a cool guy. That being said, the fact that I care about these things means that Sol Bianca The Legacy succeeded at keeping my attention and making them impactful. It is something that executes on its character bond surprisingly well, even if it does contain some forced melodrama from time to time. Where the original may have struggled with character investment because all the characters are kind of one note here and we only have 100 minutes to get to know everyone, and the crew is already extremely familiar with themselves, here, the characters getting to know each other and themselves is kind of a subtle theme here that makes everyone more interesting. June and May become sisters. April and Feb learn how they really feel about the directions that their lives are headed in. Percy and April make a good pair, and Gyunther kind of learns to move on. In fact, I want to say that Gyunther and Percy are excellent additions to the series as a whole and add important outsider perspectives to the crew of the Bianca, and important character arcs and character inflections that may have not otherwise occurred had outside views not been introduced. Now, of course, no character is really the front and center of this series because it's not really a character story, but overall, with one exception, the characterization here is quite improved and quite interesting. Now, getting to that exception, I really do gotta question why Feb is written the way she was. Yeah, I can understand that there is a logical basis for someone living this kind of lifestyle would question it and want to settle down, but how it's executed here simply doesn't work in my eyes. I mean, there was already the plot of needing to find Earth to find May's parents, so why add this weird little depression arc in such an intrusive manner, especially if it's not going to facilitate the actual logistics of the plot stuff. Like, if there was a need to discover Earth by tracking Gyunther to Earth after he captures Feb, then yeah, it would make more sense, but here it just feels kind of intrusive and unnecessary. There is some logical precedent here. I can understand where she's coming from, especially from an emotional side of things, and this even allows Gyunther to get some nice character development in, but its execution is simply kind of clunky and feels like a disservice to Feb. I understand that we need character drama in order to ramp up suspense and whatnot, but seeing as that there's already this unease about possibly surrendering May after growing so close to her throughout the first 3 episodes, I think there was ground enough for character tension here. And there was also room for character tension considering that Gyunther himself was and is an interesting antagonist for most of the story. I just feel like this whole exploration of Feb's character kind of comes out of nowhere, and it could have been done a lot better if they really wanted to explore this facet of her character. It's something that could have been done in either a way that was less intrusive and more congruent with the plot threads already established, or that if they really wanted it to be front and center, could have been done in a way that made it more impactful to the logistics of the already established plot threads. As of now, it just feels kind of tacked on and weird. Something that is done very well, though, here is the production technicals. Sol Bianca The Legacy is a beautiful piece, and one that was, at least for a little bit, ahead of its time. Although being from the 1990s, it has the look of an AIC animation from the mid-2000s, and I assure you that this is not an insult. In fact, it looks a lot like Armitage 3 Part 2, and regardless of how you feel about that movie's writing, I think it's fair to say that, at least on a surface level, it's a beautiful movie. With its digital production and even certain design cues, notice the lip shadowing, both simply look great, and Sol Bianca The Legacy is something of a precedent center for this kind of production, seeing as that it is technically a 90s production. It's a vanguard of sorts, giving us a new look into the deeper, fuller digital look that would become the norm in the early 2000s. Everything here is just so bold and full, not dense, but powerful, and I'm a sucker for this kind of fleshed out look. It's also great seeing how the animators infuse this new style with the design direction and cues of the original to create a world still very much in line with that original. Yes, they're obviously done differently, but there is still some connective tissue here paying homage to the OVA of the past, and both feel like the vision that was imagined for the original OVAs. A lot of the audio stuff is also pretty good, especially the OST, which is surprisingly nuanced and developed for such a short production. Unlike the originals, Legacy's OST is surprisingly large, but like that of the original, it does fit the piece very well and even contains some catchy vocal pieces. It's not often front and center, but it will be when allowed to be, and it always helps us ingrain ourselves into the world of the series. The dubbing, too, is also pretty good, and while I didn't recognize any VAs other than Wendy Lee, everyone here has a pretty good performance and delivery. I also appreciate the consistent world building in the word choices of the script, as the intermittent use of Spanish, Latin, and Italian terms is in line with the creative vision sought out here, and it does add a subtle world building element throughout the series. In fact, the only real quirk I noticed about the dub was that although I have been referring to her as May, the dub never actually translated her name, so in the English version of the series, she's still called Mayo. I don't mind this fact, in fact I find it pretty humorous, but it is a neat little window into the inconsistency of late 90s and early 2000s dubbing and translating. This aside, the only actual nitpick I have with the technicals as a whole is that the editing takes a while to get into a groove of sorts. Episode 1 is rather choppy at times, and it's clear that the editing team didn't quite know how to make all of its scenes flow into each other smoothly. Luckily though, by episode 2, everything starts to feel much more natural, although questionable editing flow and decisions do still rear up every now and again, especially in regards to some of the logistical decisions that don't make too much sense near the conclusion of the series. Overall, Sol Bianca The Legacy's technicals are executed very well, and this allows the series to lean on them in order to get away with some editing and writing technicals that are not necessarily the best. On the topic of OVAs and productions as a whole, when we zoom out, Sol Bianca The Legacy is a fascinating jump into the new digital animation looks and techniques of the 2000s. Although a 1999 piece, it's something that looks like it's from 2005, which is not an insult, but just a testament to the production sort of Vanguard status. It's important to remember that while we all have certain mental images of what 80s, 90s, 2000s, and modern anime should and should not look like, the production field as a whole is not a monolith, especially back then. For perspective on this, let's compare this to Puppet Princess, another favorite of the channel. Can you guess which one's older? That's right! It's Sol Bianca The Legacy. Now, for the record, I want to say that I like both the quote older look of Puppet Princess and the quote unquote newer look of Sol Bianca The Legacy. But seeing that both came out within 24 months of each other is just crazy. It's a window into a very specific, very unique transitional time when certain things were starting to get more digital and incorporate CGI and stuff, but many other things continued in the time-tested and I'm assuming then cheaper methods of the past. Both should be admired for their admirable execution of their techniques, and the fact that they could literally stand side by side in real time is amazing. I think for this reason, Sol Bianca The Legacy is underappreciated just from the technical legacy that it has when we really zoom out. On the topic of zooming out, I think we should also look at the characters briefly, in order to not only pay homage to them, but just how they kind of fit into this production as a whole, and because I like looking at characters. Gyunther's cool because while he does seem like the stereotypical anime nihilist, there actually is some nuance to this guy, and he doesn't necessarily force his nihilist ideology on everyone past a certain point. Basically, he's pursuing the Sol Bianca out of an empty quest to try and protect or preserve the remnants of Earth, a Earth that he once idolized as a vibrant and lush paradise. It's not though, and upon learning this, he becomes an empty but self-aware man who stays on the job simply because he has basically nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. He lives in remorse over having fantasized about Earth only to learn it's dead and having wasted his life chasing this impossible dream, but he doesn't necessarily toil in that remorse enough to really let it impact his job as a professional or his view of others. In fact, I think the show does a decent job of showing that he actually respects April once the series concludes, and that he does seem to value his subordinates to some point, even if he is extremely cold. I don't think he dislikes people, I think he's just a sad boy for lack of a better term. He thought he saw something in Feb due to perceived shared nihilism, but once he sees that this isn't the case, he kind of just lets her go, because well, he doesn't really care about anything. Overall, he's surprisingly refined and interesting antagonist. And tagging alongside Gyunther is Rammy, which is his initially gung-ho and naive subordinate. Now, Captain Rammy is a pro-Terran patriot who isn't really thoughtful and is just a very cavalier guy who wants to get the pirates dealt with as soon as possible. That being said, he does defer to Gyunther's authority and have great respect for this accomplished man. He is sad to learn that the Earth is dead, but we do still see some character growth in him as he goes from very gung-ho to more thoughtful and less cavalier, going so far as to actually being the one that advocates the retreat when the Sol Bianca almost blows them up. He doesn't do too much past episode 2, but he's still a good counterbalance to Gyunther's sad boy vibes, and someone which really helps just balance his scenes out a lot. I think he's a fine tertiary addition to the series. Just like Percy, who I would say for the second half of the series actually elevates in the secondary character status. Now, Percy is the small-time pirate leader who hits on April and actually seems to go out with her after that point, and I really kind of wish he survived, because he provided just good life advice to her and seemed genuinely interested in her. He was genuinely being helpful a lot of the time, and he was just a cool guy. He was effortlessly cool, in fact, and I really like the moment he takes to just get her out of her slump when he says to her, look, I know you think you messed up, but fixating on that isn't gonna unmess anything up. You gotta get off your butt and do something. Which I think was something that she really needed to hear, and I'm glad someone said it, although I'm not glad about the fact that he did die. F in the chat for Percy, although I will say that he is likable to the point where his death is tragic, so I guess Sol Bianca did succeed in that regard. Finally, that gets us to a few notes on the crew themselves. There's April, the headstrong leader of the Sol Bianca crew, who is also surprisingly passionate and refined. She's a woman who chases her dreams across the stars without really realizing or thinking about what they are, simply looking to achieve meaning in what she does, even if not really sure about why she does these things. She's a very interesting character and one that makes for a good protagonist because she's confident in herself and competent enough with her abilities to be interesting and inspiring, but still unsure enough and unaware enough to have interesting flaws to look into for character drama and whatnot. They did a good job writing a character who isn't too weak and who isn't too strong. Someone who feels relatable and real, even if some of the melodrama she's involved in does feel a little forced at times. Next, we should talk about June, who is kind of the smart one of the group. June starts off as smart and spoiled, and her antagonistic relationship with the exact opposite Janny reflect upon this. However, as the series goes on, while she does maintain her smarts and somewhat spoiled demeanor, her bond with Mayo becomes her defining trait, as she goes from tolerating her to essentially becoming her closest confidant and sister. There is a good arc throughout the series where the two bond as sisters and almost become inseparable by episode 6. It is really nice seeing how they barely tolerate each other in episode 2, and how in episode 6 they're inseparable at some point. In addition, she's also psychically bonded to G, that is the computer system of the Sol Bianca, and in some way is actually able to physically work within it. It's an interesting little quirk of the series that, while not necessarily too developed in, it makes enough sense in the no-sense world of Sol Bianca The Legacy to get a pass. Overall, June is a fine character, and it is nice seeing how her bond with Mayo mellows out her spoiled and kind of brattish temperament and forms a more mature and caring one. Next, there's Janny, who, like in the original Sol Bianca, is still standoffish and belligerent. Unlike June and some of the other characters, Janny doesn't necessarily develop all that much. She's quick to act and impatient when we first meet her, and at the end of the series she's still kind of quick to act and impatient, but through and through she's still a team player, and someone that does help get the job done. In addition, I want to say that while her character is designed to be relatively unpleasant at times, she's not a jackass, and she doesn't go out of her way to be antagonistic. She's just a relatively gruff person, and I appreciate that they stuck with this and actually didn't try to do too much here, because it would feel like anything past a certain point would be forced, and they realized this. I appreciate that they know that some people are just gruff, and that's just how they are, and they stuck with that line through and through. Not the most developed character, but one that feels very natural and genuine. Just like Mayo, the small child character that unites the crew on a quest to kind of return her home, which is a running subplot throughout the series. While having a child character in your movie may not be the best idea, reference to the Phantom Menace, here, Mayo is not annoying or dumb, and she doesn't do anything that forces any real plot contrivances for the worse. I mean, she does force a few contrivances, but nothing bad. She's not stupid, she's not annoying, and she acts relatively mature for her age. She's a relatively well-behaved child. And I do like the fact that the crew of the Sol Bianca do form a protective nucleus around her, as they sort of form a pirate family based upon protecting and raising this young child, someone they genuinely seem to care about. I also want to say that the series does get bonus points for actually getting her in the power armor in the final episode, something which I didn't see coming, but that they managed to make feel relatively natural enough. Unlike the character of Feb. Now, I think if there was a character to be divisive or disliked in this series, or at least their handling of it, I think Feb would probably be that character, because how she is written and characterized throughout the series, while making logistical sense in my head, doesn't feel natural in how it's portrayed on the screen. Like in the original Sol Bianca, she's initially a fun-loving and esoteric wino, who, while having a drinking problem, seems to be genuinely interested in those around her, and seems to genuinely provide some decent life advice every now and again. However, when we get to episode 4, we can see that her drinking problem stems from an inadequacy burning inside of her. She feels lonely and she feels like she's wasted her life being a pirate and not just having settled down and done something more productive in her eyes. Well, this is of course a very natural thing to feel or question. I can completely understand the motivation behind this, especially if I was in her situation. How the series handles this feels a little forced, because she gets into an argument with April about it, and then just goes off drinking on her own, and then gets captured by Gyunther and becomes the damsel in distress. Like, again, logistically, this makes sense in my head. I could understand someone storming out after having an existential crisis and whatnot, and comforting it themselves in the addiction that they are so familiar with. That makes sense in my head from a logistical standpoint. However, just how it's done on screen feels kind of forced, and I don't really like how from this point on Feb is not so much a character as a MacGuffin that April and crew have to rescue a whopping 3 times in order to finally convince her that, hey, maybe the people you've been living with for 10 years actually do care about you and don't want you to just give up on everything. I understand what they were going for, but I just feel it's written in an insulting manner because she's not really given time to air her grievances or really emote on her pain. Instead, this is done by other characters who just kind of tell characters in the scene, and therefore the audience, that hey, she's an alcoholic because she's sad about she feels she's wasted her life being a pirate or something, instead of Feb having an emotional or impactful monologue on her own part. They don't really do anything with this character past episode 4, and I can understand how that can be frustrating for someone who's watching this and just saying like, hey, like, if you're not going to do anything, at least tell us how you feel. But she doesn't, and I don't really like how she's handled. It just doesn't feel the most respectful in my eyes. With the character notes concluded, there is one last thing about Sol Bianca The Legacy that I really want to touch on, and I do think is a somewhat prevalent through line throughout the series, which is the idea of letting go of the past. This is a nice subtle theme baked into almost every character here, and baked into the series as a whole, and a nice little moral for us to take away from this little adventure. Everyone here, in some way, needs to let go of the past, and seeing how they do it does add a nice little thematic layer to this show, which honestly is not the most deep. It's this idea that, yes, the past may have been great, or the past may have sucked, but regardless of which one it is, we can't fixate on it. Every character learns this in some way, and it impacts them for the better. Gyunther, for example, learns that the Earth is dead, and while this does depress him, and he does become a doomer, his encounters with April and the crew of the Sol Bianca do remind him that, yeah, that sucks, but life goes on, so I guess I gotta get back to work and figure out what to do with my life. April, meanwhile, finally gets the gun of her aunt back. However, she learns that the relics of the past are not the be-all end-all, and that, really, while they're neat little trinkets, they can't really compensate for actual bonds and such, seeing as that she establishes a new bond with Mayo by giving her aunt's old gun. Feb learns to move on from her feeling of regret having quote-unquote wasted her past. Percy tells everyone to live in the now, seeing as he unfortunately has to die in it. Janny seems to deal with her undisclosed past in some way, and May and June grow past their initial dislike of each other in order to grow into very close sisters of sorts, and help May get over the tragic loss of her parents, which happened so long ago, and shaped so many of the early years of her life. I like this little theme baked into the series, and think it's a nice little touch note to end on. Overall, Sol Bianca The Legacy is an amazing OVA simply for the fact that it exists. In a world full of incomplete OVAs and bittersweet conclusions that we never saw, Sol Bianca The Legacy is an exception to this rule, and it is glorious simply for that fact. It is glorious for the fact that it is an embodiment of people coming back to a dead franchise and saying, "You're not gone yet," for taking the time to reimagine it in a way that makes both more sense and is more captivating. It's amazing that this random, unfinished series of OVAs from the 90s got a beautiful, gorgeous miniseries, and while I don't think this was the most commercially successful thing, I think it is successful as an artistic showcase. Yes, the writing is not the best, and the editing is choppy at times, but from an audio and visual standpoint, it is genuine art, it is genuinely beautiful, and it is genuinely beautiful that this exists, not for the sake of being a cash grab, but for the sake of people wanting to come back and make something complete that never really seemed to have a chance at being completed in the first place. It is something that is amazing for that reason alone, although it is also amazing for the character bonds that it builds, for the interesting lore and plot that it tells, even if it becomes incoherent past a certain point, and for just how unique it feels. Although I kept wanting to call April Naomi because this looks like Armitage 3 Part 2, it's definitely its own thing, and it's definitely extremely memorable for its character bonds, for its looks, for its feel, for its general vibes, for its OST, and the fact that it exists, and for that reason it is a fascinating, obscure anime memory.